Hello everyone, today we talk about the beginning of the First Morean War, a very important passage in Mediterranean history that follows directly the victorious defense of Vienna against the Turks in 1683. It's a very well-known topic that we discussed many times. Here and there we add some other sort of in-depth insight on the actual campaign, but there is also a lot of surrounding events, politically, strategically, that after 1683 reverberated that great Christian victory. You know that on Schwerpunkt we tend not much to give space to sort of every internet subculture, non-popular topics, but the ones that were actually important that people still fundamentally do not know of. I mean, one thing is ignoring like a fringe reality and, of course, like talking less about that in both qualitative and quantitative terms. There are some powers, some countries, some regions that are even subordinated to the bigger players and do not emerge even as independent powers capable of waging war on their own. Very often these become the targets also of expansionistic policies and more. Then there are powers that may be secondary in rank compared to especially the bigger ones in the game, but that still by the second half of the 17th century are part of this much more, and really in a European average sense, like common type of power that definitely contribute to the efforts, not just of the bigger powers, but very often make up the same in forms of coalitions, as we've seen, for example, in the War of the Holy Alliance and the general effort of the Habsburgs, Poland, the papacy, many other powers, and even elements coming from like the Protestant houses of Europe that traditionally would not support Habsburgic policy, for example, but really wanted to spill blood, pursuing what was still very alive knightly sense of grandeur and need of participation into combat and more. We've seen this for many different figures. We're also resuming a series about Prince Eugene. Recently, we made a video about the Battle of Petrovaradin. We've seen how, in that case, a really small power at the time, the Principality of Lucca, still sent his nobility and even scored important results in the ranks of the imperial officiality, rewarded by the same Prince Eugen himself. We will talk more about these theaters, and that's the reason why it's necessary to discuss the First Morean War, 1683-1690, waged by the Venetian Republic and her allies in the wake of, in fact, the Ottoman collapse after 1683. Of course, the Ottoman Empire remained there, but had begun to lose an important amount of territories, or at least it would, also because, in fact, not just the Habsburgs were pushing from Central Europe, but the Italians, and in particular the Venetian Republic, immediately realized that after centuries of vexations at the hands of Ottoman forces and privateers, they could regain a big deal of territories that they had historically conquered in Greece back in the Middle Ages, and that especially the Serenissima had the means to further lead. All right. Another huge leviathan, rather than elephant in the room, is the siege of Candia that we've never really discussed, which is really so momentous in history for a number of reasons. It's not just a staggeringly heroic resistance of the Venetians against the Ottomans, and the success, at least in bleeding the Ottoman Empire white, to the point that, in fact, even the later expedition towards Vienna can be considered fallimentary, and or at least as a reaction to the heavy blow suffered at the hand of Venice in that campaign that lasted 20 years, right? And really obliged, for example, the Muslims not to pay their traditional alms to the orphans and widows anymore as a duty of Islam in order to supply the army, the navy, against Crete, right? And its defenders. It is also an important siege, among others, because it marks, in spite of all, as a Venetian defeat at the end of the day, the end of the Serenissima as an actual superpower that is often forgotten as far as this definition is concerned, meaning that many people talk, for example, about the Venetian Empire. Venice was never an empire. Like the properest political and institutional definition of the Venetian dominion and territorial extension is not imperial, and it rather follows the patterns, especially at sea in this case, of like a medieval maritime republic. We made lots of videos about not just the Venetian military, but also at this point, especially the navy, but also about other maritime republics, including in the Balkans with Ragusa, for example, to explain essentially what we're discussing. But in this sense, also the end, together with the Venetian superpower, of Italy as an actual superpower. All right, this is in the second half of the 17th century. This is when Italy, in terms of richest per capita country in the world, is surpassed by England, by the United Provinces, that in fact are also providing, as I made a video about, the Armata Sottile and Grossa, that you can check out for better explanation regarding the more traditional sort of galley and galleass forces Venice could deploy in the Mediterranean, and instead the more sort of galleon based force that the Northern Europeans were bringing, successfully bringing to operate in the Mediterranean as well. And I made multiple videos also about galley and galleon warfare. We'll come back on this topic because we are intensifying naval warfare content, even though I'm a bit of a landlubber, even as all swimmers, telling the truth. I love the sea, but not much. I was, to get in the Navy, actually. The history of Venetian power in this regard is, in fact, the one of a remodulation, right? A substantial power, especially against the crumbling Ottoman Empire in regions that, especially from the sea, could not really be defended anymore, for the simple reason that, as we'll see now, if your major land force has just collapsed, you will, aside from all the political upheaval that was notoriously triggered within the empire, you can't put together a fleet, which is something constitutively much more difficult and costly. There is something similar, for example, after Lepanto, that was, however, a naval battle in that sense, witnessed at least the rapid reconstitution of an Ottoman force. It would have not been enough, really, if Christians had opted for pushing to Constantinople at that point. And that's a very interesting what-if scenario that, again, I don't venture in because I don't like what-ifs, as you know, but that speaks in there also of the actual magnitude of military power that was still waged in the Mediterranean. In that case, where essentially 1 century, a bit more than 1 century before this, in the second half of the 16th. So the perspectives regarding the different powers and actors very often are, let's say, precluded just for some sort of historiographical reasons, as we will well know. For example, I came to prepare the first video about properly Italian arms during the Italian wars, and, for example, about artillery, I realized that there is very few around. Admittedly, there is a reason for that during the Italian wars as well. It's not like the Italians, not being politically united, didn't actually have some consistent artillery in their army, but apparently there's very few just written about that. And so everything can get a bit towards the wrong direction, or at least no direction at all. That's the greatest problem with this historiographical vacuum, so to say. At least the Morean War is well documented because of the participation of Morosini. The fact that here we're talking at some of the greatest legions also in the annals of Italian military history, and so at some point the United Italy accepted that, at least as far as certain figures that had not been particularly, so to say, compromised by Risorgimento standards of the 19th century with Habsburgic powers in the previous centuries, could be exalted, and of course, in the case of Venice, like that primal example of naval military force that could have not escaped, like a country that, in any case, was to rebuild a navy and to gain that sense an important place, among back again among great powers in the 20th century. That's also yet another story, as I'm preparing a video about the British raid on Taranto that tells a lot about that background as well. And just for saying that this is not such a long time ago we're looking at the end of the day, it's basically not even 400 years ago. And, again, in fact, a time and a place that we tend to mostly study for Northwestern Europe, the battlefields of Flanders, the clashes between the great coalition, including, in fact, the same Habsburgs, still a Holy Roman imperial power that many also Italian subjects of the same would bring its part of its effort to sustain the same Venetians that, as you know, were not part of the Holy Roman Empire. The First Morean War is, in this sense, a byproduct, as we've seen, of the Christian victory at Vienna, and so an external trigger for some very important changes within the same Venetian policy that at that point had mostly maintained, as you know, some conservative, preservative attitude towards its political and territorial integrity among powers that, since the Italian wars, had increasingly constrained the Serenissima within her lagoon and part of, in fact, her broader naval maritime dominions. In fact, up to 1683, the year before, Vienna steadfastly committed to the principle of peacefully maintaining her dominion. The Venetian Republic had followed a rigorously defensive strategy, built around, also in a broader military political sense, what was considered a triad of arms, almost, in a sense. Remember that Venice, by the way, is the first country in history that properly separates in terms of armed forces the navy, right, with its own apparatus, its own administration, its own command, etc., from the land forces. This is very important. The Venetian arsenal was one of the most advanced in Europe. Still, I don't know when Peter the Great was to reconstitute, to build actually from scratch a Tsarist fleet. He went first over to the Netherlands. If you'd think, okay, they were more advanced than Italy at that point, wasn't it? Actually, the Dutch built, for example, their ships still in a very handcrafted guild fashion. They didn't really have a centralized. Of course, at that point, there was a Republican government had began to concert like this production in a more cohesive way. But there was nothing like, even in terms of actual design, preparation, organization, armament, uniformity, something like the Arsenal of Venice. We're still talking, in fact, here, the beginning of the 18th century, not, in fact, far away from these very events. Historically, Venice had relied on this triad. The first one is definitely, it depends on the importance, but let's start from the fortresses, all right? She has mostly a naval, maritime, coastal dominion, aside from the Italian mainland, where she has historically created a terra firma in the northeast of the peninsula. In order to maintain a typical maritime coastal dominion, you need fortresses, right? Because it's a very medieval concept, and as we've seen, also in recent videos, modern siegecraft at this point was nothing but just an evolution of the same. And these fortresses were effective in as much as supported by a navy, and in fact a top-notch one, and they could simply be resupplied in case of siege, right? The other element, the navy was the second. The third were local militias, right? Venice was historically famous for having a quite unitary, concentrated power, but not quite a centralistically oppressive policy compared to other powers. Because most of the communities that we just described, protected by fortifications across the Mediterranean, wanted, given the preponderance of the Ottoman Empire, was politically to remain protected by Venice. And so there wasn't actually much of a need to convince them otherwise. And their militias were historically structured just to defend, of course, their own fortified cities, to which, in fact, defense Venice also contributed in different ways. But the system remained mostly one of the local militia. This was debatably the weakest link in Venice's strategic framework, because in all of this, Venice did not quite have readily at hand a major army. All right, armies in Europe, as we explained, really were constituted by the same identical formula that can only vary in degree. Professionals, very often mercenaries, then some sort of feudal levy nobility, and then the militias. All right, so Venice had that too, but she had not invested in a solid, sort of available professional soldiery, mostly because she did not feel particularly threatened on land by any major power that mostly counted, in fact, on her also sort of laid-back attitude as far as potential continental ambitions. And therefore was not capable of quickly or in the moment deploying lots of forces just already ready, right, before sustaining, say, a major campaign, right, also defending fortifications, etc. Naturally, Venice was still very rich, and so she thought that she could simply hire troops. This is something, for example, that the Dutch will historically do. Besides, Venice was notoriously considered in the Protestant world a honorary member because she had managed to keep the Inquisition out. It was a place where books could be printed more or less freely, and especially the Protestants admired that, even though, again, the Venetians were obviously fully Catholic in all of this. And that's interesting, considering our videos about confessional warfare and of this year. Well, this year has been already a bit surpassed with the Treaty of Westphalen, but still it was quite strongly felt, of course. Now, aside from militia, the other two components of the aforementioned tripartite framework, the navy and the fortresses, were undeniably complementary in one sense, right? Particularly in a dominion such as the Serenissima, where islands and coastlines, as we explained before, took precedence over the mainland, right? But in a sense, also not quite the same thing. In fact, they were separated. The navy depended on Venice, the fortresses on the, as we've seen, the scattered communities out there. Naturally, there were Venetian noblemen ruling from there as well, but mostly they did so as some sort of top governmental functionaries, like officials, not much, because, as we explained, had really a crushing manpower, could simply keep any people under. They didn't need that, right? It was really no political pressure for it. There was a decision always to be made whether to bolster the fleet or the fortifications. If anything, especially those on land, meaning not the ones of Venice that had fortifications, but at large, like relied on the lagoon historically. And if anything, most of the Venetian military financial policy debate revolved around these two directions. What do we do? Do we want to be stronger at sea or stronger on land? Because, especially in the latter, we don't have an actual soldiery, and depending on the pressure that routinely arrived from the Ottoman Empire was quite serious, as we've seen for Candia. That was really a big thing, right? One of the single greatest sieges in the history of mankind. This was not a banal point, right? And there was hardly also the same navy and the fortresses were quite costly. So building an army in its own regard was also something a bit more complicated for bigger operations. Up to this point, as we've seen, the Ottoman Empire was too big to simply go at invading places. The siege of Candia had also sacked a lot of resources just in defense. And as we've seen in Europe, there was not really much of a space outside to expand. So things remained balanced, even sort of not immobile, but definitely on a bigger scale, not really coming out of this. Since Venetian strategy leaned heavily towards defense, the latter option, that is to say the fortresses, was often favored over the former. Fortresses were deemed more critical than ships. In other words, a 1683 inventory of artillery recorded that the Republic controlled, at this point, 34 fortresses in total. 12 on the mainland, right? Because you have, in fact, the aforementioned northeastern Italy naturally was quite important because it was populous, developed, and so on. 2 in Istria, 10 across Dalmatia and Albania. So these are mostly coastal and as you understand. 5 in the Ionian Islands and 5 in mainland Greece. All right, that historically had been partly maintained, in fact, by Venice. And for that, it's also true, as we record in other videos, for example, for the Byzantines, that controlling some of those coastlines was essentially sufficient to control an important part of the mainland. This was true also as far as, for example, the Dalmatian markets were concerned. There was a lot of traffic with the Ottoman Balkan interland, for example. And that's an interesting side of the story because, as you know, the Habsburgs and the Venetians jointly subsidized, for example, Serbian resistance against the Ottoman Empire. There were the Iduks, etc. That's a very, very, very important part. And we made some videos about Hungary. We talk about Croatia a little bit. We also talk about the Krajina in the videos about the Habsburgic frontier with the Ottoman Empire. So again, we'll come back on that topic because these had been also the battlefields of the Turkish wars in general, both at land and along the coast at sea. The number of fortresses, besides, if we were to look at this in historical perspective, was actually set to grow substantially, in part also because of the crisis of the Ottoman Empire and Venetian expansion through the Morean conflict. In fact, Venice would control 46 fortresses by 1710, 78 between 1718 and 1722. That's also because, again, territorial acquisitions and losses, etc. We should also point out that not all of these fortresses, especially the ones recovered like from actual sieges, maybe had been stormed by the same Venetians, were not in good repair, or at times sufficiently equipped with artillery, because again, you could simply, take over an important chunk of land, but you will not have, so you will have all these castles that, as you know, if you visit Greece especially, you will know that you find all the historical, like that there is, an Hellenic Acropolis, then the Byzantine castle, then basically the Frankish castle from the Latin times, and the Venetian one at the same time, etc. Right, and you find also the Renaissance Venetian fortifications. But at most, they were also controlled by the Ottomans at a point, and as such, if you count at least these ones, especially in the interland, were recovered, and that were not, in fact, necessarily simply on the line of fire for most generations across the centuries. You could and would control them, but as Venice individually wouldn't have necessarily as much guns to supply them all, to make it stand in all of them in a uniform way. Of course, there were ways to carry guns, of course, wherever you needed them the most, but in general, right, there were all these kind of issues to control. The reason why I talk about the Morean War, by the way, is to give a look at this campaign also in all its complexity. Like, you would think that this is, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, maybe just a secondary theater in the bigger scheme, etc. But it shows how difficult waging war actually is and all the complications that can arise from this. By the way, today we will talk just about the first year, the first 2 seasons, so to say, of the the good seasons of the First Morean War. But in fact, things drag on for years, right? Just like the War of Candia, by the way. So, in all this, neither the fortifications nor the artillery were consistently adequate in general, though the 1683 inventory noted over 2,400 artillery pieces in total, which is impressive, and shows how, after all, much the Venetians did actually care and succeeded in maintaining an important firepower, especially in defense, in all these fortifications. Their maintenance and ammo supplies were often deficient, admittedly, right? Of course, they could be replenished in case of need, concentrated wherever the enemy attacked. But if anything, there was a problem involving the aforementioned lack of soldiery. All these fortifications demanded large garrisons. You don't simply garrison even these fortresses with militia, because also military engineering is starting to become something complex. You need skilled personnel, like a professional military of sort, to handle them. And given that, in fact, there was really a limited troops number available for mobilization, this was a bit the Achilles heel of Venetian strategy, stemming from the circumstance. It was a good enough kind of scenario, right? But like in warfare, it's completely normal that things are going bad to begin with, or not optimal for sure. And then there is also political reasons for that. How much do you actually care about the war? In the case of a sudden Ottoman assault, providing swift aid to besieged strongholds would have been extremely challenging in these circumstances. If you don't have even a few thousand professional soldiers readily expensible for that theater, because again, you have to control still the Italian territory and these other fortresses, so you can't have all these troops everywhere, and you can't even simply pick them. And creating a gap that can weaken other theaters, right? These troops really cost, all right? So this is a problem, and due to the outdated recruitment system, gathering the necessary mercenaries to address any emergencies could take months. Yes, there is enough money in case of need of emergency, but it's mostly the timing. It's how you actually find these people, how you contract them. It's not like simply mobilizing troops. Even by 17th century standards, we're somehow there. Again, the Venetians had their own Italian sort of republican force for the city and the surroundings, etc. But that functioned mostly for that purpose, not much for an overwhelming military power to simply be delivered overseas without further, cost increase. That is what Venice was mostly trying to avoid. Nevertheless, the triumph at Vienna in 1683 appeared to shift perspectives regarding this, because it's also kind of obvious. Why didn't the Venetians have these soldiers? Because they didn't have much of a chance to use them to begin with. At this point, things were changing. Even in fact, an area like the Ionian Aegean theater that was not directly affected by the military operations of the siege of Vienna. And the Ottomans really chose for Vienna. In that sense, they could have attacked Warsaw. It would have been, of course, more logistically demanding, but it was still in their possibilities, like technically attacking Italy itself. But that would have been the toughest of all, because of all the fortified cities, the coastal dimension, the western navies, and so on. That's part of the reason why, again, Venetians felt by this point relatively at ease, in spite of the heavy blow they had suffered after the loss of Candia. In fact, that was the psychological edge. After Crete, the loss of Crete, it seemed to the Venetians inevitable that the Ottomans, though still nautically inferior to the Westerners and to the Venetians in particular, would ultimately dismantle what the Venetians called in their language Stato da Mar, which means the state of the sea, right? And the Turkish capability and intent to do so were clear, by the way. The Porte did not hide, of course, that gradually the Ottomans would have had to expand further the detriment of Venetian coastal possessions. Now, with the apocalyptic blow suffered at the gates of Vienna, the Turks did not fare too well, and many in the beautiful lagoon city believed that the situation had been reset. Right? The Pope, by the way, that as we've seen had really saved Vienna, at least in as much as without its finances and especially diplomatic negotiations, it's unlikely that we would have seen, I don't know, an Habsburgic-Polish alliance in that moment, etc. The Pope, you know how much of a last-moment save that was, right? So, but the Pope, that naturally had always been pushing for a crusade purpose, and I also made a video explaining, especially after the 30 Years' War, how much the papacy had tried to resume yet another crusade against target. At this point were not the Protestants. The Pope astutely recognized the sentiment spreading through the Venetian Republic, with the Ottoman land forces retreating. This was happening in the moment, because of course Vienna is September the 11th. That was the bad season. Of course, the Turks were scrambling at this point to put together as many forces as they could back, but again, it was mostly like the political situation was frozen, and so they were incredibly vulnerable. In fact, the Ottoman army had been entirely routed, telling the truth. The Sublime Porte would struggle to master, in particular, if it was difficult to master an army, to stand back on its legs once again in a defensive posture, you can imagine to master a fleet capable of threatening Venetian holdings again. And even putting up an adequate resistance in the moment. As we've seen, sieges had been incredibly costly. And in this quite sort of rocky, coastal, amphibious Mediterranean theater of operations. Yeah, admittedly, the Ottomans had gained a lot of experience in that during the War of Candia, but they were not this hyper-functional system that could simply reapply, I don't know, some high-quality warfare, or even any kind of resource at that point to simply protect most of their Ionian, Aegean towns, right? So it was now Venice's turn to seize the initiative and go on the offensive. This is kind of obvious, right? It's the most straightforward political and strategical goal that you can pursue in the moment. The key figure in the diplomatic efforts that persuaded Saint Mark, the Republic of Saint Mark, to join the Holy League, right, that had been formed, in fact, to defeat the Turk, as envisioned by the Pope himself, and initially met with skepticism by many, was the Cardinal Pietro Vito Ottoboni, a Venetian cardinal who served as the unofficial envoy of the Serenissima to the Holy See. In return for its commitment, Venice gained command of the papal galleys out of the primacy that was, of course, expecting to the most powerful naval force in Italy, and just such a traditionally glorious one, reinforced, however, by the other major, in this sense, properly, say, Italian or at some point international, but in this case not Spanish or Spanish-controlled like Naples. In fact, Maltese and Tuscan units as well, along with a subsidy of 100,000 florins to sort of smoothen the logistics, like finding the material more quickly, etc. All right, so this is an important naval coalition mounted up by Venice and the papacy, together with the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, the Order of the Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John. And we'll talk, by the way, soon about these, because, as you know, they're a bit very much and literally on the forefront in Malta against the Ottomans, the Ottoman privateers, etc. There is a glorious Maltese military history there, that it's not just about the famous siege back in the 16th century, but also really that international spirit of European identity in a Catholic knightly order that was still quite alive, and as we will see now, capable of fighting and dying just like that. I mean, the highest aristocratic fashion, right? The Tuscans themselves had the order of Saint Stephen that they had created exactly for going at sea against the Turks. In the same way, the Pope, as we've seen, had its own galleys. Venice dominated. Besides, the Venetians had a commander of excellence that we mentioned before, the Captain General of the Sea, an official Venetian title that was bestowed, of course, on the 65-year-old hero of Candia, Francesco Morosini. Right, this incredibly capable, experienced, charismatic admiral that we will hopefully also make lots of other videos on. But he was chosen for First Morean War. Then you had other names. You have Girolamo Strasoldo, who was assigned to lead the troops responsible for executing landings. Antonio Zeno, named Proveditore of Dalmatia and Albania in the meanwhile. So these, as we've seen, coastal centers, the dominions of Venice along in the Adriatic, in the Ionian, had to fully support, directly support, together with Venice, the Christian offensive in Greece against the Turks. And so it was also a matter of administration, finding the resources, manpower, etc. In the venerable aristocratic republic, fervor for the prospect of restoring the overseas dominion. Some people would say colonial empire, but again, Venice was not nor a colonial nor an empire. Like to begin with, colonies, yes, in general there were, but not quite in the sense that is mainly discussed today. Simply because it was not its time, not to have anything specific against colonialism, but it's a slightly different reality. And I also prepared a video explaining a bit how in the eyes of tradition, later imperialism and colonialism really appear, which is a slightly different thing from what, after all, the same tendency to exercise power and control would occur. If anything, the ideological premises or implications, right? For example, what does it mean to be an empire in a Protestant tradition, right? That's something you must explain historically, because it's definitely not aligned with even the theology the same Protestantism professes, as opposed to the Catholic tradition. Now, of course, the Venetians, and imagine, as we explained also in other videos where I reiterate how traditional this war still really was, how much religious zeal existed in all this, how much this call for war had been galvanizing also the variously vexated coastal communities that we discussed before, because of the perennial Turkish presence and threat, even in the hinterland, as we've seen throughout the previous centuries. And so all these numerous humiliations inflicted by the Ottomans that now had lost it and were to pay, they had to suffer from their side for them. Now, there were many well-founded and authoritative voices in the Senate of Venice questioning the prudence of joining the Holy League in a broader international sense. From this era, there are many beautiful relics of this time. So, for example, the geographer Coronelli dedicated himself to an impressive output of maps and atlases, some of which I used myself in the pictures, for the pictures here, as you can see, which served to remind Venetians, but also the broader Christian world, so also not just the Catholics, not just the empire, that, as we've seen, the Venetians had technically never been part of, if not from actually the Byzantine one. Naturally, again, we'll talk more about Venetian history, not to create misunderstandings. Of course, like the Venetians had always been like within the West in a broader sense, but still. The importance and grandeur of St. Mark's historic achievements, meaning that again, Venetians could really boast a hell of a naval tradition that in this moment, historically, prospectively, seemed to be rising again after, again, especially all the trauma of Candia. However, this was the problem, substantial funds were required to support the kind of military campaign that was emerging, and mostly the soldiery. This is a bit like one of the biggest problems, not the biggest one at this point. The Serenissima's government, as it had during the War of Candia, raised money through every available means, not only through taxation, but also by selling public offices and conferring noble titles on wealthy commoner families for 100,000 ducats each, right? And that's basically like what the florin is in comparison. Nonetheless, reclaiming the major islands was no longer even contemplated, right? Instead, focus shifted to a nearer region, the Morea, whose control would be easier to secure. There are many reasons for this. Indeed, there was a bit of a trauma after Candia, as we explained, but there was an objective difficulty in seizing certain certain islands without, say, swarming within the interior and seizing so many other outposts out there. Fighting suspended at sea, like the Ottomans had done, like to seize the St. Crete, would have been incredibly costly, right? And so it was better at this point to expand paradoxically on the mainland, a policy that the Venetians had never been too much enjoyed, but that they could more modernly at this point attempt. And it should have not been really difficult at that point. Greece Morea is the Peloponnese, basically, and what was a secondary land for the Ottoman Empire, right? At least Greeks were important, but mostly like in an ethnic sense within also the Ottoman administration, etc. But the Morea was relatively peripheral compared to the Dardanelles, to the St. Constantinople, obviously enough. And as such, it could be, however, still considering the geographical proximity, a thorn in the side for the same sublime port. In order to achieve success, given the incredibly momentary advantage of the situation, it was really exceptional as much as the Ottoman siege of Vienna had been exceptional. It was imperative to act swiftly, capitalizing on the setbacks the Ottomans were experiencing in Hungary. The arsenal operated at maximum capacity, building 28 galleys, 6 galleasses, that, as you know, were essentially bigger ships with a higher deck, with greater firepower and so on, and 12 ships of the line, as we were saying before. So basically, the newly updated sort of oceanic designs that were starting to be, again, but with multiple decks on a greater line, that were concentrating more firepower as opposed to the oaring space and having sail propulsion enhanced by their structures. Additional vessels were also bought and acquired in other means. So as you understand, it's not an enormous fleet altogether, but it's still punching, and it's proportioned to the task. The Venetians had, again, a good command control. They knew their deal, right? So they realized this was really the right moment. The fleet departed Venice on June the 1st, 1684, making a stop at Corfu. On the 16th of June, Giovanni Capello, the legation secretary, temporarily acting as the Venetian bailo in Constantinople, so basically the ambassador, the fixed ambassador at the Sultanial See, delivered the declaration of war to the highest-ranking Ottoman official present, the Kaimakam. Afterward, he narrowly escaped disguise to Smyrna, where he boarded a merchant ship and successfully returned to Venice. Right? He was lucky. There was a French ambassador who was shot by the Ottomans through a cannon into the Bosphorus, into pieces. So, well, that was a bold, like a courageous action. You had to flee pretty quickly because the Ottomans did not have much of a good and tender temper. His actions may appear less than dignified if you think about it, because he could have been a Christian martyr under the Ottoman scimitar or something worse. But they formally marked to, say, the declaration of war against the Ottoman Empire, which was still important. There are many... there is much folklore, so to say, to the clashes even between the Venetians and the Ottomans that were ritualized at some point. This is the age of, lace, ballet. There were at some point some Venetian forces crossing the Dardanelles in full, uniform. It's too anachronistic to say, but all paraded like on the deck, defying like the Turkish coastal guns. Just to say, like a giant mill thing, and a massive show of attributes, by the way, in the process. For example, during the War of Candia, etc., Morosini was also bits like that symbol of defiance for the Turks. Naturally, the way also, what happened at the courts and between ambassadors is very important, because literally like giving like the declaration of war in that fashion and escaping it was pretty clamorous, and it was of course a big Venetian slap to the Ottomans, driven primarily by the confidence in the superiority of this as it was called heavy fleet from the Venetian side, consisting of 13 state-owned ships supplemented by just 2 armed merchant vessels hired for the purpose. Now, it should be emphasized, before delving into the campaign's progression and focusing on specific episodes, that naturally here we recount, because they are, if anything, very colorful and revealing of the general military customs of the era, that the outcomes fell short of expectations. At least the Morean War turned out to be more challenging than it seemed. I will see now why, of course. There was still a bit of Venetian defensive bias for the ship, for the ship's operability per se. The Venetians had been so much focusing on defense that employing this naval force in an offensive strategy aimed at securing a quick victory against a slippery opponent was too optimistically evaluated, especially considering, again, like Ottoman resistance. These constraints were intensified by the novel line of battle tactic, which was introduced to optimize cannon fire and enhance control and discipline. But it also made the attacker's task more difficult, right? Because galleys could operate in a much more individually effective fashion. They had kind of a greater mobility. They could also enter shallow waters at some point. Now, these bigger vessels they had more firepower, but you had to align them in a particular way. You had to maintain them like that. You had to calculate a bit like the whole sequence of fire. And so, for example, addressing the challenge of approaching the enemy while maintaining formation and without fully using their weaponry is the main challenge in the moment, right? Strategically, the situation was also, of course, complex. You don't just walk into Morea even if the Ottomans are shattered. In fact, only a sustained and consistent blockade, such as one at the Dardanelles, so closer to the Turkish snares, could have, at that point, properly prevented the Ottomans to sustain, like to help any kind of defense in Morea. The modernized fortifications at the Straits and a political diplomatic context far less favorable, say, to Venice than during the War of Candia rendered an effective blockade highly difficult, right? Things had improved from then, also from the Ottoman side. And so that leverage that had historically been there. The Venetians, again, had defied, we were recounted before, had defied, saying blocked multiple times, was not an option anymore. Furthermore, in Venice, expectations were set on a swift and conclusive naval victory. That was the public center in a way, with only a minority prepared to accept the prolonged timeline needed for a strategy of attrition, particularly given the outcomes of the amphibious warfare led by Morosini with the, instead, sort of the sottile fleet of galleys, the lighter ones, that, as we've seen, were less punching, but they could, at least with method, clear the coastlines, allowing, in fact, for also more effective landing and troops deployment in the theater. Naturally, of course, the trauma of Candia had at least deluded somewhat, and now things would simply change all of a sudden. And there was, as we've seen in Europe, a great Catholic joy for the events of Vienna. So this cannot fully be understood, if not in the traditional spirit of the time, but this metaphysical threat of the Ottoman Empire, especially to these peoples like the Italians, the Central Europeans, that had really received the full might of Turkish force at some point, was so deeply entrenched and really meant a cosmological order being shattered in the name of the victorious Christ's royalty. The Venetian patricians held exclusive command of the galleys. This was very traditionally their prerogative, right? I made a video about the traditional meaning of the patriciate, right? And you understand why they had this imperial control. They also served as officers and provveditori for garrisons. We pointed out before, from the mainland, the Venetian terra firma, essentially, to Dalmatia and the islands. So they were in charge in those communities. Venetians and Croats made up half of the 8,400-man army that set sail in July 1684 to besiege the fortress on the island of Santa Maura. These names are Italian because at that point, of course, the Mediterranean spoke Italian, and Greece had been mostly contended by them, and the Turks were not this great sailors in sort of as a general preponderance. The Italians had already dominated the Greeks during the Middle Ages, and so at sea especially, you find all this Italian names from the cartography of the time, from the fact that, of course, Italian was the language of modern Europe, and so basically all the West spoke that, called these places in that way. This is located off the Greece's northwestern coast. Alongside the Corfu garrison, 2,000 Greeks from the Ionian Islands served as auxiliaries in the Venetian forces, as it was proper, given that, again, these Venetians had been ruling over these Greek places. And so, of course, the auxiliaries next to the Italian soldiery and nobility were mostly Greek themselves. They were also supported by 150 Orthodox monks, interestingly enough, who bolstered their morale. And of course, for the Greeks, it was something close to a war of liberation, and or at least we're far from the age of fully fledged nationalism like in the 19th century, but there was, of course, something to it. Of course, the Greeks had been the ones who had opened the gates to the Turks, but now, they had had some time to ponder the consequences of their actions. Approximately a third of the Venetian army, besides, consisted of Germans from Braunschweig and Hanover. So literally, as we were saying before, there were Protestant, not just volunteers, but powers that were willing to allow, of course, for this deployment in service of, in this case, a Catholic power, just also to gain experience acting as military observers, and again, just because they liked to fight as aristocrats. These Germans had been purchased, so to say, by Venice at 200 florins each. A similar army was deployed, by the way, in 1685, comprising soldiers from Braunschweig, Saxony, here we're talking by polity, obviously, and Württemberg, because these are all Saxons, of course, enlisted under their own banners and practicing their Protestant faith during military operations. And the Catholics, of course, leaving them practicing their heresy, because at the end of the day they were useful soldiers, and in any case it was on them in front of God. These guys, by the way, in 1684 were paid 3 months in advance as well, which means they were good troops after all. The fact that the initial target, the fortress of Santa Maura, was close to Corfu, which was Venetian, and served especially as the winter headquarters for Morosini during the operations. Morosini took supreme command of the Allied fleet, as we've seen, and an army facilitating operations. It was not a split command, say, the Venetians their own way, the Tuscans, no. All the Venetian, the Papal, Tuscan, and Maltese forces were under the Venetian admiral. The Pope had probably been the first to say, okay, well, these galleys are yours, right? Together with the crews and the marines, etc. At Corfu, the Venetian forces were joined by the 5 Papal galleys, 7 from the Knights of Malta, and 4 Tuscan galleys. The Tuscan galleys had sailed from Livorno, that, as you know, was a Medicean creation in the Renaissance, as a port that had been, in fact, the major base of the Order of St. Stephen. These galleys were under the command of the Vice Admiral Count Camillo Guidi of Volterra. That is not a coastal city, by the way. And he distinguished himself, however, in July 1675, back in the day, in a skirmish off the island of Elba, in where Napoleon was exiled, the first time against galleys from Bizerte. So these were Barbary pirates from North Africa, belonging, in fact, to the notorious corsair Ciriffo, as he was known in Italian. We'll talk, if anything, about those engagements, because, again, they're really interesting. They're a bit, how many times have you ever read anything about these guys? There's a whole chapter of Mediterranean warfare revolving around this. On the ships of the Order of St. Stephen, in particular, that again were these Tuscan forces, and then within it there was the one of the Order of St. Stephen. There was a military order, right, founded by the Medici. A contingent of the infantry was embarked, led by Sergeant Major Pietro Serrati. Additionally, a powerful vessel, the Grand Alessandro, the Great Alexander, was hired for 1,500 scudi per month, carrying a landing force of 600 men. So you understand, it is a small but compact, it's a medium compact force after all. And the instructions given by the Grand Duke of Tuscany to his squadron's commander regarding ceremonial matters were noteworthy, by the way. They were not to concede to any claims of precedence by the Knights of Malta, because there was an actual rivalry between those and the Order of St. Stephen. In fact, any interaction with the Hospitallers were to be avoided. They were to take the vanguard positions, by the way, which was a very bold proposition, and this kind of Tuscan provincial or municipal competition, it was projected towards the broader international scenario. And obviously, if the Venetians had actually not allowed, because there was a rigorous discipline after all, and command chain, Morosini was a hero also for all these other guys. This had not been permitted, right? Just to going to wherever you wanted with your ships and going ahead of the others. The High Command, the Tuscan commander was to abandon the fleet and return. So this was, as you know, not probably the best proposition in this world context, because you're sending your troops ahead and you want them to be on the forefront. And as we will see, actually the Tuscans will succeed in fighting pretty hard and taking many losses in the process as well, showing their actual commitment. And there was a real sense of primacy that they wanted to bolster in front of, again, the Venetians, the Maltese knights. Were not really the least among especially naval forces in terms of experience and prowess. This directive was as firm, by the way, from the Grand Duke as it was ambiguous, right? Because, again, it can be a form of cockery internationally wise, but kind of why? You're spending a lot of money to just join this expedition, and why would you withdraw just because somebody told you not to be a fool and say endanger the entire array just because you want to be the first guy who starts combat? Like it's sort of bad and weird. On the morning of July the 16th of 1684, the Allies held their first meeting as well. On the fortress's esplanade, a review took place of the 8,000 landing infantrymen, whose command was assigned to Count Niccolò Strasoldo. He was a nobleman from Udine, which is a place in Friuli. We made a video about medieval Friuli. It was one of the possessions of Venice, also contended in part with the Habsburgs historically. On the 19th of July, the Allied fleet set sail. With the Tuscan galleys, guess where? Having been granted to lead the vanguard, right? And we don't know what had happened there because it's not like we have the records of how they agreed to this. But the Tuscans literally went there and said, we want that or we withdraw. And so Cosimo de' Medici, that was ruling at the time, immediately had himself heard. It's also possible that the Venetians and the Maltese had tried maybe, okay, let's go send these guys to take the toughest losses initially, so maybe we also get we get rid of them more quickly, but more usefully than in all this. There was the Capitana and Padrona, that were the ship, the most important ships, the command ships positioned forward at the center, and a sensile ahead of each wing as well. So it's interesting because naval deployment is always kind of similar to actually certain dynamics of land warfare. If anything, we'll see this better in other videos. Now, in all this, what were the Ottomans doing? Actually trying to evade open sea confrontation, because this Italian force was fairly consistent, and Morosini opted to immediately besiege the imposing fortress of Santa Maura that had remained without Turkish protection. This place had massive walls, connected, by the way, connecting the island itself to the mainland only by a bridge, with another linking it to the island of the same name. So basically, there is yet another island that had the ancient name of Leucadis, that is between Corfu and Cephalonia. And again, you need a map to see this, but it was really structured in this fashion as a bird system of defense. It's also, again, very interesting. In order to take Santa Maura, of course, the land forces were disembarked. The Venetians on one side and the Tuscans on the other, while the Papal and Maltese forces attacked from the sea between the two groups. The galleys commenced their bombardment, so essentially supporting the land force. Between August the 6th and the 7th, after a siege lasting roughly 2 weeks, if you make the maths, the Ottoman barbary garrison capitulated. These were kind of, again, a mix of Turkish and sort of kind of North African privateers controlling this Greek island. However, the campaign's beginning, though marked by the successful capture of Santa Maura, already prefigured some of the difficulties of the entire endeavor. The Tuscans lost 30 men between dead and wounded. They were affronted due to the usual disputes over precedence with the commander of the Maltese ships, so saying that there was some malaise between the various contingents, Guidi requested permission to return, but the Grand Duchy of Tuscany ordered him to stay at least until September, so when the season ended. Morosini, in the meanwhile, assigned the Tuscans to garrison Santa Maura, which, of course, like as the commander-in-chief, he disposed of course, of any other kind of land arrangement when conquering these places. And the Venetian commander turned to capturing nearby Preveza, employing this time the Hospitallers in the vanguard. From there, so he bypassed the Tuscan problem by simply leaving the Florentine troops in Santa Maura and allowing the Maltese, that had taken less losses, by the way, because the Tuscans were also, proven in this, were used as the vanguard. From there, ideally, seizing Preveza, Strassoldo would advance to Albania, right, encouraging the local populace to revolt, to rise up against Ottoman oppression. By late September, however, the Venetian allies returned to their ports. So they literally left. During the winter break, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, offended by the behavior of the Knights of Malta, and again, they had all their problems with them, negotiated with Pope Innocent XI, who in agreement with the Venetian Senate abolished salute volleys between naval squadrons to avoid disputes over the number of shots fired and returned, because they literally were coming to argue over this stuff, for how much they actually had become paranoid towards one another. This, however, did not resolve the issue of precedence either, because normally when these galleys met, again, there was this normal salute, and they raced for the number of shots and whatever. Imagine the poor gunpowder wasted in the competition between these people. They had to be the more noble, the more gentlemanly in behavior. So, in the next season, we are in May 1685. Operations resumed. Right, you don't have to kid also with Mediterranean winter currents, etc. Like, it's tough. Like, and we're talking the second half of the 17th century. These are still very sort of primitive and archaic times, after all. Guidi at this point was instructed by his lord not to sail alongside other ships to avoid further meetings and to land the St. Stephen contingents separately before later joining the Venetians. So this was really serious. Again, we can't even imagine just behind the scenes what kind of tensions and how kind of personal the thing had gotten between the two sides. By the way, we know more from the side of Florence and from the side of Malta about the issue, but it's even comical to an extent. In the meanwhile, these operations were really intense. Right, even think this from a personal point of view. Morosini, that as we've seen was an old man by this point, felt the burden of his advanced age and the exhaustion of managing disputes among the allies, by the way, which was really annoying. This left the Venetian admiral weary and discouraged. He requested even to be relieved by the Doge and the Senate of the Serenissima. However, in Venice, confidence rested solely in him. This guy was a war hero. Everybody knew that his insight, at least, was the best one. You don't need just insight, you need this sort of firm belief, best psychophysical shape, and so on. Naturally, he knew his deal, even through the age, but it was really stressful. He, nevertheless, remained, due to the Venetian decision, in his role. All this while the campaign started with some delay, partially connected with it. In June of 1685, during the assembly of the Allied fleets at the Cur Solari Islands, the precedence issue resurfaced once again. Guidi greeted Morosini and the papal contingent's commander with a flourish of trumpets, but ignored the Maltese, and when the War Council, deciding to besiege Coron, convened, the Tuscans did not attend. Nonetheless, it was telling that the Tuscan commander was respected and admired more than before for placing the common cause above personal pride. Morosini's strategy involved first targeting Coron, a former Venetian port at the southernmost end of the Morea Peninsula. The stronghold was attacked between June and July by a force of 10,000 soldiers, because, of course, in the meanwhile, further troops, remember the world recruitment issue, was being surpassed. At least these mercenaries were being cumulated. The expenses were sort of more manageable, as there was more competition, at least among those who wanted to join. On June the 25th, the Tuscan ships disembarked 300 infantrymen and 43 knights of St. Stephen, who, without a banner, joined one of the regiments of Prince Maximilian of Braunschweig in the service of the Serenissima to begin the blockade. The Ottomans mounted a relief effort for the besieged stronghold of Coron. Disaster was narrowly averted thanks to a bold counterattack of such intensity from the Italian and Allied side that it captured the main Ottoman encampment sent to relieve Coron. Right, so this action was really formidable. By July, the Christians had encircled the besiegers with trenches, but an assault by 8 companies selected by lot from all regiments present, including the Tuscans, and led by the Count de la Tour Maubourg, foiled their efforts. So an interesting case of circumvallation, counter-circumvallation, trenches that gradually, expand to surround the same besiegers that surround the Coron. It's really the warfare of the era. We've seen in the video about Vauban how things really worked technically. In the siege of Candia had given so much to the St. Venetians in terms of experience there, and these assaults in the dirt, in the mud, are really something to behold, because of thinking that the nobility, this point we were making also in the other videos of this kind, how the nobility of Europe would simply go fight and die in these, after all, very apparently secondary theaters for all the right political and strategic reasons, but still contrasting the golden ideal of the Apollonian Imperium with this chthonic, sweaty, bloody, dusty, and smelly dimension of some of the lowest carnage. Meanwhile, on July the 23rd, the Tuscan galleys sailed, alone or with Venetian ones, we don't know actually, however, along the Peloponnesian coast in the Gulf of Nauplia, unsuccessfully challenging the Ottoman fleet there. Again, all places that we know well from different videos also on the same classical Hellenic warfare and more. Now, on August the 7th, the Tuscans took part in capturing the Ottoman forces' encampment sent to relieve Coron. Right? They did not, however, await the stronghold's surrender, departing immediately due to unusual ceremonial disputes that we have learned by now. 3 days later, after a siege lasting about 50 days, Coron capitulated. This was yet another victory. And so you understand gradually how this proceeded. And it's really comparatively, I made lots of videos also on this topic, not very different from medieval warfare. Just a bit more noise because of artillery fire, and especially the kind of this point, and a bit more maybe spectacular in other ways, but still, it's a very heavy grinding work, and it's about trench digging, tunnels, bombardments, and more, attacks, counter-attacks. Diplomatic endeavors continuously supported military operations, of course. Venice was, at this point, deeply concerned about its Tuscan ally, particularly due to the importance its support held within the uncertain and fragmented European political landscape of the time. There weren't too many powers actually backing this enterprise, after all. It seemed more like, again, an Italian thing, and especially from the Protestant world, aside from, again, these paid troops that, as we've seen from Saxony, there wasn't really too much of an enthusiasm towards it. Naturally, the French were very much unhappy of the outcome of the Battle of Vienna, as we know also from the story of Prince Eugene's escape from Paris and from France, literally. There was, again, just another dimension of especially northwestern European, but also oceanic colonial politics and warfare that here wouldn't see the Mediterranean. As a consequence, really, these single contingents that, as we've seen, are small but, say, effective and are a bit like walking on the edge of strategic balance. And Venice does not want, of course, to fail in all this for all the money that they had invested in. In all this, the Tuscans were waging their parallel warfare of some kind. For example, they added 4 galleots to the Venetian war effort in 1686 by seizing from these ships from Algerian corsairs that had been fighting. Also, they provided the Serenissima with 2 vessels carrying 800 soldiers and 7 St. Stephen knights to the 4 galleys already committed with the Tuscan contingent. However, issues arose with the soldiers, as lacking rowers to complete the galleot's crews, they were asked to serve in that capacity. Most refused, necessitating the recruitment of others willing to fill the rowing roles. This delayed the squadron's departure planned for April. The Tuscan ships then faced further delays in the Tyrrhenian Sea as the campaign against the Ottoman Empire had left Italy's coasts vulnerable, which could not be left exposed to Barbary pirates, for example. So until additional galleys were armed in Marseille, Genoa, and Naples, because of course these other powers to some extent had some involvement at the same time, the Tuscan vessels could not reach the Greek theater of war yet. Guidi arrived at Corfu, in fact, only on May the 30th, and on June the 2nd he was joined by Morosini at Navarino, the place of the famous later clash, where after seizing the old castle, the fortress was besieged. It's another important stronghold. The landed troops were led by the Veronese field master San Sebastiani. Verona was part of the Venetian terra firma state. If you're interested in that, there is a medieval history series about Verona that I made years ago. While the 7 St. Stephen Knights, who did not display the order's banner at this point, were commanded, meaning that they were under somebody else's command. In fact, the one of the Pisan, Giuseppe Alliata. These are all names of, again, these were all noblemen, aristocrats that, again, joined because of the various, the compensation, glory, the general international promotion that could derive from the participation to this military enterprise. And again, it was the hype was there, because in the meanwhile here we're not describing what is happening to the Ottoman Empire, but of course they all wanted to take a piece of glory, the collapse of the Turkish domain. It was just such an obvious thing at the time to want the Ottomans dead. Land operations were led, by the way, by a Swedish mercenary general, the Count Otto Wilhelm von Königsmark, who had succeeded Strassoldo in the meanwhile. And this mention is quite interesting for a connection that quite indirectly leads us to Maurice of Saxony, that I made a video on a couple of years ago. If you're interested, as you know, he was one of the greatest commander of the later year of the first half of the 18th century. But it's important, in fact, to discuss about this Otto Wilhelm von Königsmark. He hailed from a distinguished family, including General Hans Christopher, who fought in the 30 Years' War against Poland for the Swedes, because these were, we say, of course, like in the European nobility was quite international, right? There were people very different blood here. And at that point, Hans Christopher, in that circumstance, had become a field marshal of the Swedish army. His nephew, Philip Christopher, a colonel, served the Elector of Hanover. He mysteriously died in 1694. He was possibly assassinated for being suspected of an affair with his employer's wife, by the way, which would explain it. This tells you, by the way, what kind of violent environments these were also among the nobility. Philip's sister, Maria Aurora, 1662-1728, was briefly the mistress of George I of Hanover. After her brother's disappearance, she relocated to Dresden, where in 1696 she bore a son famously by the Elector Frederick Augustus I of Saxony, before retiring to the Quedlinburg monastery, which seems quite fitting after such a life, becoming its abbess, by the way, in 1701. Quedlinburg has an important medieval background to that. Again, it's one of the souls, monastic souls of Saxony. And you know that her son, with Frederick Augustus I of Saxony, would be the same Maurice, 1696-1750, the natural son of the Elector of Saxony, who later became King of Poland. You know that also during the Great Northern War, we've seen something about the Battle of Narva. We'll come back on that theater as well. And we made a video about him because he's such a famous person. I mean, Maurice, his son Maurice, trained for a military career from youth, and from 1736, most famously and successfully serving the King of France, achieving extraordinary successes, including the famous Battle of Fontenoy, but also the capture of Prague, for example, among his sort of quote-unquote secondary achievements is really heroic and epic. He introduced key tactical innovations to the military art of the time. This basically is also what we've seen in some videos about 18th century French warfare, a bit like the golden age of that century for France, after the age of the Sun King and before the disasters of the 7 Years' War. So much so that in 1744 he received the most distinguished honor of becoming Marshal of France. So Maurice of Saxony is just such an epic figure we described in that video. A portrait of women, blood and glory, because he was a womanizer. And, if you're curious to know how he died, that's quite a story, by the way. Just for saying, what kind of families in this case from Germany, from Sweden actually, but they were all mixed, as you understand, would come to fight, for example, during the First Morean War. For Venice, her allies, again, it was sort of a big international strife. And it's fascinating, again, to see Catholics and Protestants just for that mix of purposes to simplify it together, because in part it had been dreadfully ignored really since the beginning of the Reformation in some circumstances, regardless of the incredible bloodshed of the previous centuries due to confessional matters. Now, we were in 1686 on June the 4th. At this point, the Ottoman relief contingent's camp was stormed. As at Coron, this success soon led to the fortress surrenders. One by one, these Ottoman fortresses are being taken down. Despite their short presence, the Grand Ducal gunners demonstrated exceptional skill. Right, the Tuscans, after all, had that good name, their reputation in this context. They had, at some point, I also made a video about the failed attempt to reconquer Constantinople that had occurred at the beginning of the century, and it failed. It ended up in disaster, but still, it gives an idea of the extent of not much of the ambitions of the Grand Dukes of Tuscany, but also the actual strategical projectional capacity and possibility for powers of the time to even seize Jerusalem from the Ottomans at that point, because it's not like the Ottoman Empire was a cohesively homogeneous unfragmentable system, telling the truth. And even the Tuscans alone could have a saying in that. Morosini ensured that the ceremonial requirements demanded by Guidi on behalf of the Grand Duke of Tuscany were fulfilled, and so the Tuscans, elated and emboldened by the recognition, proceeded to join the siege of Modon, other important fortress. These names recur, if anything, because they had historically been controlled by Venice before the Ottomans had stormed them in the 15th and 16th century. Here, the Tuscans worked to construct a double line of circumvallation. Right, circumvallation is very important in warfare because, as we've seen here, the Ottomans are going to come to relieve the besieged at some point. So you need some external protection, which is exactly what the Ottomans paradoxically did not satisfactorily do at Vienna. I made an entire video about the lack of circumvallation entirely of the same Ottoman trenches around Vienna. By the way, the Tuscans were joined by the Galleys on the 22nd. Between the night of July the 28th and the 29th, the sapping work began 150 paces from the stronghold's curtain wall, which surrendered on July the 7th. So chapeau on the Tuscans once again. Naturally, there were other troops here, including the rivals, the Hospitallers. After the capture of Modon itself, the Order of Malta's fighters, in fact, made a significant sacrifice, losing 200 men. And again, I would like to point out that 19 of these guys were knights. All right, so these men were some of the cream of Europe, devoting themselves to that lifestyle, and again, fighting and dying in these Greek castles, sieges. It was then decided to target Nauplia itself, because that was very important historically. And after re-embarking the expeditionary force in 2 days with the Tuscan galleys in the vanguard, and they had somehow by now won by merits that position, operations commenced once again on July the 30th. Now, at this point, the Ottomans reacted more vehemently because Nauplia was an important fortress. Again, the names are mostly either, this is I think Italian, because I think it's Nauplia in Greek. In any case, the Peloponnesian Seraskier, Ismail Pasha, had 5,000 troops. These were mostly mounted fighters, interestingly enough. And we've seen the type in our videos about Ottoman lighter cavalry, so to say, because that's what it mostly would be about. It was also heavier cavalry, and they decided to move. Right, they were encamped near ancient Argos, so we are essentially in the southeast. So on August the 6th, the Allies, meanwhile, took the initiative, storming once again the enemy camp. They knew that relief force was there, and they succeeded to raid the camp, which for horsemen is also kind of a bit of a greater issue. However, this was risky as well because the Ottomans had all that mobility, and the Turkish cavalry, in fact, launched a fierce charge. That, however, the Christians repelled, thanks to the infantry's discipline and a newly introduced weapon, the bayonet. Right. This is quite interesting because it shows really Western firepower at large against this sort of more medieval kind of troops that the Ottomans maintained from their sort of Pontic, also Asian dimension. And at this point, Western firepower was really something. The linear tactics were starting to be to be outlined. I made also a video about the doctrinal differences exactly from these years, because these are also the years of the Wars of the League of Augsburg, right? And so lots of things are more around, around that chronologically. So more or less, we're talking the same thing. And the bayonet is really something from these years, and at least introduced in a consistent sense. And the ones used in this circumstance in Greece by the Italians and their mercenaries were still the wooden handle type inserted into the rifle barrel. So essentially a long straight dagger with the handle fitted into the barrel itself. And this did not actually prevent the front rank from firing, by the way. In fact, it used the rifle as a pike at the same time. The units formed battalion squares against cavalry, which already tells you again how, again, we were talking about strictly operational standpoints. When do you actually see, well, there are instances in Central Eastern Europe of, also in the West, forming infantry forming square against cavalry, but while punching, cavalry is not so numerous in the West. Here, again, the Westerners maintain it cold blood. They realized the Ottomans, yes, were many, but they couldn't quite simply overwhelm them through choosing this formation. The front rank kneeled with fixed bayonets, and the other troops were deployed 30 paces back, firing volleys by platoon. This was very orderly combined armed tactics, excellently delivered in defense. The Ottoman right wing attacked the left of the Christians, where the Tuscans were positioned. The Tuscans repelled the Ottomans. The situation remained uncertain on the rest of the front until 2,000 sailors landed in the meantime, threatened Ismail's flank, so putting in crisis the Turkish formation. The Ottomans were obliged in this sense to retreat. And again, it's very interesting how you can overwhelm an army fully committed into some kind of linear clash when you just throw some crewmen, in this case, armed in sort of in a fortune fashion, so to say, on the flanks of this formation. This tells you, of course, how committed the whole expedition really was to coordinate this attack and so on. The Ottomans retreated in disorder up to Corinth on the other side of Morea, but from there, on August the 29th, they launched yet another attack on the siege lines. The maneuver failed once again. Consequently, Nauplia also surrendered because there wasn't much in the province, anyone who could come to relieve them. And this is really a momentous victory because having the Ottoman provincial capacity to defend Morea collapse, also the various strongholds across the land do. In fact, one by one, Sphacteria, Kalamata, Kielafa, Mistra, that is the ancient Sparta, by the way, and Argos fell. Right? So basically, most of Morea fell into the hands of Morosini. As we pointed out at the beginning, this entailed, however, also a great deal of responsibility because this was a pretty large swathe of land whose fortifications had to be reorganized, defensive military units to be secured. Morosini took care of all of this for the newly reconquered territories. So for that year, the campaign was deemed concluded. In early September, the Allies sailed to the ports where they would winter. As it was habit, of course, also the Ottomans wouldn't move. At that point, the Tuscans were really a bit the heroes of the situation. If you have noticed, they really had a reputation. Nevertheless, they paid for that. Right? If you want to be first all the time, you have to somberly nurse your wounds, to say the least. In fact, their losses were notably heavy. For their contingent, that as we've seen was not immense, 300 between dead and prisoners, 240 wounded, 70 of whom were later captured, by the way, in the Mediterranean, in the Gulf of Taranto itself, by Tripolitan pirates as they were circumnavigating Italy and to come back to Tuscany. In fact, they were basically just coming home on an isolated tartan, transporting them, and they were ambushed. So you can imagine how sort of bitter, and as was said before, how primitive this whole scenario really is. I mean, imagine the Mediterranean in the 17th century. It would have been a marvel, actually, if you have all these landscapes, etc., but on paintings. But just think of how the world actually was at that time. It's something incredible to even realize. And so you have to make this astonishing count in order to realize that by the campaign's end, more than 2/3 of the Tuscan forces engaged were out of action. So a staggeringly high amount of casualty that, however, also corresponded to the staggeringly high Tuscan morale, which is incredible, like their determination, their commitment. And again, this is yet another sort of, I should open like a Tuscan warfare playlist, because also that notion of that guy from Lucca, plus all our medieval history content, like provide us with a pretty substantial amount of Tuscan warfare in this sense, and I'm just going to check that. But again, I'm pretty, I'm really glad that we have been talking about the Morean War because of the relevance, let's say, of this of this war, but also of the general, as you understand here, implications, general international scenario, sense of duty, of identity, of belonging, of commitment to a crusading spirit, right? You see here we have reached 17 videos on the 17th century. It's mostly warfare. And again, I'm really glad of this because that's exactly where I wanted it to get at some point. It feels almost incredible because, admittedly, most of this stuff derives from some generic browsing of certain topics, and then we talk a lot about the Viennese theater, etc. But there is really a lot in terms of also a more general overview on this period's warfare. If anything, we have to talk more about Spain, more about France, also a bit more, again, about Central, Eastern, Northern Europe. There is so much, but I'm glad because, again, the battles here fought are a bit forgotten, but equally important and showing, again, a very interesting picture of the whole clash. Here, these are the same years, by the way, of the siege of Buda, for example, and you have all the epopee of Prince Eugene. So I think one of the most interesting things about this content is realizing how, say, in parallel things were happening, how you can't really see history just from one side, and the parallel, the fact that on Schwerpunkt you can really look at the parallel stories of the same continent, the same Europeans, etc., I think is quite instructive. It can be quite useful. There's a very interesting perspective in this all. So again, I'm particularly glad about it all. For the rest, we will, of course, go on with the First Morean War that is not over, by the way. If anything, we will have to look at some more, for example, like individual aspects, like how these people actually fought and died in consistent ways. So again, there is plenty of stuff we can, at some point, observe. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.